How are you suffering right now? What is going wrong in your life? This morning, when you consider things that you don't like, what is your greatest source of pain? Are you feeling alone? Wish you had that special someone, but you don't? Is there something that you're disappointed or frustrated about? Is there something that's happened that you pray to God would have never happened, but it did, and it's one of those things that can never be undone? Maybe worse, is there someone that you love who is suffering right now, and you can't do anything about it? There's plenty of suffering in the world, right? A friend of mine, a very good friend of mine, a couple of years ago had to bury his 19-year-old son. Last year, I had a student ask if she could come and talk to me, and began to talk about abuse in childhood that I almost didn't think was possible for one human to do to another. Or maybe it's just the daily grind and suffering of being a single mom. I grew up that way. It was just my mom, me and my sister, and eventually my sister's baby. And when I think back on my mother's experience, it was a lot of suffering. How are you suffering right now? What is that one thing that maybe you go to church to forget about, and unfortunately I've brought it up for you to think about? You know, one of the things I really appreciate about the Bible or the Christian scriptures is the level of honesty we find in them about the human experience. When we go to the ancient book of Ecclesiastes in what we call the Old Testament or the Hebrew scriptures, we find the writer is almost like an ancient emo singer-songwriter. Or maybe the screenwriter for an official selection for the Sundance Film Festival. If you've ever seen those movies, they don't start here and have a lot of conflict and end on a happy note. It's just problem after problem and more problems, and the movie ends. We find this kind of tone in this ancient book in the Bible. We'll be reading from Ecclesiastes chapter 9, a few selected verses. All share a common destiny. The righteous and the wicked, the good and the bad, the clean and the unclean, those who offer sacrifices and those who do not. As it is with the good, so with the sinful. As it is with those who take oaths, so with those who are afraid to take them. This is the evil in everything that happens under the sun. The same destiny overtakes us all. The hearts of people, moreover, are full of evil, and there's madness in their hearts while they live, and afterward they join the dead. Again, very inspiring. But you see what the writer's saying, whether you're good or bad or trust in God or not, suffering is coming for you. A few more verses. Verse 11. I have seen something else under the sun. The race is not to the swift, or the battle to the strong, nor does food come to the wise, or wealth to the brilliant, or favor to the learned, but time and chance happen to them all. Moreover, no one knows when their hour will come. As fish are caught in a cruel net, or birds are taken in a snare, so people are trapped by evil times that fall unexpectedly upon them. Ouch. Again, it doesn't matter if you're good, doesn't matter if you're educated, doesn't matter if you're talented, doesn't matter if you're strategic. Bad things that you do not expect will come to you. So as was mentioned, this is our first in 6 weeks where we're a series that we're calling Hurt. We're exploring the spirituality of suffering. And apparently Pastor Ryan was like, look, I need an intro week. We'll have 6 weeks where we'll get into the practical matters or encouraging or hopeful or things you can do. But I just need a week where someone just says life is suffering and everyone feels it. And he was like, I know, I should have Brian Ross do it. He would be the perfect person. Actually, this morning someone texted me and said, I saw the Midtown email, you're talking about suffering. It'll be so different from the light and inspiring conversations we usually have. But this morning, what I'm going to do is just offer a few reflections on human suffering. It's not an exhaustive list. Again, this is only week 1 of 6, so there will be other weeks to get in all sorts of details. But as I often do, we're going to have time to interact today. So if you have a comment or a question or a kind disagreement about something I say, you'll have time on the microphone to offer that up and a little bit later. I've also created a handout. Professor, so here comes a handout. I think it's a little easier to track that way. We won't cover everything in it, but if nothing else, if you're having a hard time sleeping later this evening, you can look over that. Okay, so 5 reflections, introductory reflections at least, on suffering. Number 1, if you are in the midst of an especially difficult time, feeling alone, know that a whole bunch of the rest of us are suffering too. You just may not know about it. So again, number 1, if you're in a particularly difficult time, suffering and feeling alone, know that probably most people also are. You're just unaware of it. Now, by making that opening statement, I am not trying to make light of your problems, your struggles, your pain. I'm old enough to have seen a lot of things, and there's a whole lot of hurts in the world. I'm not trying to make light of it. But when we suffer, we tend to have this sense of utter aloneness. I am the only one experiencing this, or no one else knows what I'm going through. And maybe the specifics of your suffering are personal to only you. The details might be different for all of us, but everyone is suffering to some degree. And if they're not now, they will be very soon. Jesus said there in John 16, just laid it right out, in this world you will have trouble. This is our experience. I was a full-time pastor for 16 years back in Pennsylvania in a former life. And there are advantages and disadvantages to being a pastor. Maybe Pastor Ryan could share those with you. But one of the advantages are people come and tell you things. You learn a lot about people. Because pastors are kind of like attorneys. You tell us things we can't tell anyone else about it. And so people share their lives. And it was always interesting to me, the people who I assumed were quite happy had more going on than I knew. People who at times I'm like, I wish my life was a little bit more like theirs, would find out things. There was the always laughing, happy, bubbly couple, super outgoing, always having people to their house. Life seemed like a giant party. And they say, can I come talk to you? And they come and talk. And they're like, this isn't a good thing to say to a pastor, but behind closed doors, we hate each other's guts, and we wish it was different, and we don't think it's going to last. And I remember at times I had no idea of any of these struggles that they were going through. Someone who was maybe one of the most successful leaders I've known personally, who just seemed to know how to build organizations and generate income, sharing, I have an adult child who hasn't talked to me in years. And it pains me every day, and I don't know what to do about it. It wasn't that long ago, I had a student, graduate degree, very bright, talented, call me saying, Brian, do you have any advice where my 11-year-old every day is telling me they want to kill themselves? And I think they mean it. I'm not sure what you're dealing with, and it's probably something very different than someone sitting in the same row as you, but we are all going through something, all of us. Number 2, the more that you expect your life to be happy and comfortable, the more it tends to hurt when the hurts come. The more you expect your life to be happy and comfortable, the harder it is when the suffering or the problems or the struggles arise. Now, you and I live in this very, let's just say, interesting culture that is constantly telling us that we can have an amazing romantic relationship, the most intimacy possible with our favorite human being. We can have a meaningful career that not only pays our bills, but helps us to retire early and is very meaningful. We can have friends that are always supporting us. We can have children that adore us. We can have bodies that are healthy and look great all the time. Why are people constantly saying this in our world? Well, we know why. So we'll vote for them. So we'll follow them. So we'll click and buy from them. But just being alive in our culture, these things are shaping us all the time. Probably in ways we don't realize. That gives us an expectation for our lives that are not plausible. And then when the pains come, the pain is felt even deeper. Historically, most people who've ever lived on the planet would expect that they would be bearing a few children along the way. Most men who've ever been alive have expected at some point in their life they will be called to engage in hand-to-hand combat, maybe to the point of death. Most people who've ever lived would expect regularly droughts are going to come, floods are going to come, which means we're not going to have enough to eat, and some of us aren't going to make it through. Most people who've ever lived have had a sense of probably the most corrupt person I know is our official ruler, and they're dangerous and they're terrible, but we can do nothing about it, so just try to keep your head down. But somehow, in 2024, a lot of us think things should be different and easier and better for us. You know, if you read anything about the history of Christian spirituality over the centuries, over the millennia, a common theme is our biggest problem is that we are expecting things to go well for us in this world. We're expecting it, we're trusting in it, and whenever you do that, you're always disappointed. Always. Again, back in Pennsylvania years ago, we had started a new church, kind of like this one, and lots of young people, most everyone was in their 20s and early 30s, so I was doing lots of weddings all the time. Summer was wedding. But we had one year where out of some couples I had married just about the year before, 1, 2, 3, 4, all got divorced right in a row. And my board kind of grabbed me and was like, hey, pastor, maybe you need to lean into this a little bit more. And I know divorce is complicated. Most people in my family have been divorced. Some of the best people I know have been through divorce. I'm not trying to put any shame on anyone, but it was clear something had to happen. So part of what we came up with is before we married anyone, we sent them to a couple of sessions with a counselor, and all the counselor did is would look at their personality differences and look at their backstories, and their whole job was to just tell them, these are going to be your problems in your marriage. And I'm not sure it's lasted forever, I don't know, but after that, for the next several years that I was there, there was not anyone else that I had married who got divorced during that time period. And I would regularly check in and say, hey, how's it going? You guys been married a year, 2 years? Oh, this is a problem, but the counselor said it was going to be a problem. We knew this was going to be a problem. Expectations at times can change our experience. Number 3, if you believe that life and or God is particularly cruel to you, you will sink into an even worse place and you may take others down with you. If you feel like I've had it worse than everyone else, life has been particularly unfair to me, my suffering has been more than anyone else experiences, watch out. Because bad things can come from that. See, in Genesis 4 there, it says, the Lord said to Cain, the one who would murder his brother, why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. Cain had a right to not be happy. Cain had some things go wrong. But here our Creator is saying to him, almost like an animal that wants to pounce on you, you need to watch out that that spirit doesn't take over, or bad things could happen. When we get to a point of saying life is completely unfair, particularly to me, then we think, well, so of course I should be allowed to drink this, or to back out of that, or to act like this. And all sorts of things can happen. This is the inner psychology of people that really hurt other people, is they think life is particularly unfair and it only makes sense that I would do these sorts of things. Kind of the opposite of that. Number 4, if you determine to work hard and simply not think about your struggles, it all might seem to work for you, but it often won't work for others. Completely ignoring the pain only leads to compensation, which creates other problems. So number 3, if you think life is particularly unfair to you, watch out, bad things can happen, but also the opposite. If you say, I'm going through some bad stuff, but I'm just going to man up, push through, just keep going, push that out of my mind, it doesn't just go away. Look at the words of Michelle Bankston there. Because they are shoved deep down, seemingly out of nowhere, the compilation of hurts and wounds and pain and wounds erupts, often towards someone undeserving. My late grandfather did certainly have a much more difficult life than I had. At age 6, he had to go to work selling newspapers on the streets of Columbus, Ohio, so his family could eat. He didn't have blankets and would use newspapers. He went to school with several people who ended up executed by the state of Ohio because they had committed homicides. One of them tried to kill him, stabbed him several times, left him under a porch to bleed out till someone found him. When he was 19, younger than my 2 sons, he invaded the beach at Normandy, swimming through bodies there. And if you would talk to my grandpa, he wouldn't talk about any of these things, hardly at all. It would just be like, yep, life's tough, you just keep on going. And there's a part of me that respects that. But as I got older, I don't have any memory of my maternal grandfather without a drink in his hand. 9 a.m., he's got a drink in his hand. I'm sick, and he's picking me up at school at 1 in the afternoon, and we're driving home, drink in his hand in the car. At different points of his life, his 4 adult children, if they made a decision he didn't like, he wouldn't talk to them for years. Do you think those things were still in there somewhere? My guess is, if you think about whoever it is in your life that you don't like, you're good people, you don't wish them evil, but you just don't love being around them all the time. Whoever that person is, whatever it is that you don't like about them is probably their way of dealing with unresolved suffering. And if you are here this morning and you know this hurts, this is painful, this isn't working, but you haven't told a counselor, you haven't told Pastor Ryan, you haven't told your best friends, and it's all just keeping within, you are probably hurting other people and you don't know it. Number 5, eventually your suffering will increase and everything will leave you within this world. What kind of person do you need to become, or what do you need to do to make some sort of peace with this reality? All this is very temporary. It all eventually goes away. Our jobs, our bodies, our relationships. St. James there, you see his words, "What is your life? You're a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes." What do you need to do or not do or believe or not believe? What pattern of life do you need to take on that you can somehow make peace with this reality that's coming for all of us? I mean, this should be kind of central to Christian faith, where our story says the greatest human who ever lived was unjustly tortured and condemned and executed by the state at a relatively young age. And yet God vindicated him out the other side of it. What would need to happen for you and I to make peace with a difficult life that eventually, we all lose eventually, and yet be okay with that? Okay, that is the end of my motivational speech for today. We have a few minutes to interact, so if you have a question, a comment, a disagreement, Ryan has a microphone and he can come around to you.
So I'll get us started, and when I come to you, you can raise your hand, I'll come over and I'll hold the microphone in front of your face and I will not let go. And then also, Danny, I think in the slide cues, we should have that Q&R slide. There's a number, if you want to text a question in, I do have that, in case you don't want to raise your hand and say it out loud. So down in the media bin, I think that's in there. Brian, I'll get us started. That last statement you just had about making peace with suffering. What's the balance of being at peace with the suffering that's happening, but also not being okay with the suffering that's happening, to where we don't try to fix it all, but we also aren't just complacent and just lay down to it, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, eventually at some point, suffering comes that we can't do anything about, at least physically. So I think the best of Christian writers and teachers would say, grow in your character, develop your soul, be open to becoming like Jesus. And then even when the worst things happen, you're okay. And it's not the end of the story. There is resurrection on the other side. So that, early writers would say that's why we are here. That's the whole point of this life, is to develop our soul to become like Jesus. That is an active process that takes intention. That is not being passive. But that is something different about maybe if I work really hard, I can find a way to end suffering or end these problems. I mean, it's never happened before. I don't know why we would tend to think that would happen now. Part of taking on the character of Jesus means I love other people that are suffering, and I care for them in the midst of that. but that's not the same thing as we can eradicate it. One other statement I'll say, you can also make a case historically that some of the worst things that people have ever done to other people have come in the name of, if we only can do this, suffering will end. A lot of bad things happen with that mentality.
Thank you. First question, hand raised.
I get to hold the microphone. I'm curious where you see the balance of the idea of praying for the end of suffering, praying for intercession, for healing, for conflict to be resolved, for relationships to be restored. Where does that come into this idea of just learning to accept suffering and grow in character, when you could also argue that we're promised in some ways that God will intervene on our behalf?
Yes. I believe deeply God always intervenes on our behalf, just not always in the way we would hope or desire. Again, this is the first of several weeks. I think one of the weeks in this series will be just about that, being very honest and open before God and letting it all hang out. And that is part of the process of God changing our character, is naming honestly everything to God and not trying to hide it within. So we certainly should do that. Sometimes God does heal people. God, at times, in the Bible, they're called sign gifts. And I like that word sign. That when the miraculous happens, it's a sign to remind us, not that if we're good people, we have power to make the miraculous happen all the time. Not if we're Jesus people, we have power to end all the problems in the world, but it's a sign to remind us there's more to reality than what we're experiencing right here that we can trust in. And so, yes, sometimes God does heal people. We should pray for them. We should certainly care for them. But what has to go on within us if we're okay if it doesn't?
Well, thank you, Brian. Here's one from texting it in. Why is it that so many times pastors, philosophers, and even apostles talk about the difficulties on earth, but rarely boast about what is to come after this earthly life?
Can you say that again?
Why is it that so many times pastors, philosophers, and even apostles talk about the difficulties on earth, but rarely boast about what is to come after this earthly life?
I mean, I guess it depends on who you're reading or who you're listening to, because again, we have signs. So we are physical beings living in a physical world. So when we talk about the beyond, the spiritual, the eternity future, there's a bit of a veil that we don't see it fully. And so we have signs and metaphors and stories to hint at, but we can't fully capture. So I think there's plenty there if you're reading that. Partly it's veiled, but partly in the 21st century, again, we live in a culture where people say, like, afterlife stuff is irrelevant. Help me right now. What's the practical stuff right now? And I think a lot of pastors, if they were really honest, would say if they talk too much about eternity future, people don't love it. They want it to be more relevant to right now.
That's good. Another hand? Okay, here. Yep. And I got another online one after that.
Thanks, buddy. Yeah, I was, the whole prosperity gospel, to me, plays into this. I mean, I'm thinking of Billy Bright, 4 Spiritual Laws. God loves you and has a what? Wonderful plan for your life. Then if something happens, we go, God failed me. My sister went through an incredible challenge of faith when our dad died. God was supposed to save him, and where's that written? I mean, what's your response to comments like that?
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that. That sounds incredibly painful. and this is not me trying to be flippant or cute, but it's why I think it's important that we name painful realities like we are now. I've made jokes. Obviously, this is not an inspiring talk. But it's important for these realities to stay with us, to help us reinterpret what it means to know God and what to expect in this life. And a lot of charlatans have figured out, if I tell you that if you come to my church and give money and pray and read the Bible, things will get better in your life, you can draw a crowd that way. Mm-hmm. But I would call that the epitome of spiritual abuse. Because not only does it set people up for failure, it sets people up to say, well, then I guess God isn't real. When if you've read these historical texts, you're like, this isn't what God's ever offered. The way of Jesus is never the offer to, if you follow me, you'll have a better marriage. If you follow me, you'll make more money. If you follow me, you'll be healthier. If you follow me, you'll be more popular. It's never been offered. It's, if you follow me, you will know God. If you follow me, God's life will show up within you. If you follow me, you will have relative peace and meaning even as things go badly for you. That's what Jesus offers. So I'm very sorry, but I would go so far as to say, if someone is promising the better life, it's not Christianity.
Praise God, she came out of it. But for about 8 years, it was a struggle.
Yeah.
Brian, I have two more. I'm going to pull them both from online. There's a few questions that are actually lining up similarly, so I'm going to take the one that is a personal example from their life and a question around that, and then I have one more after that to wrap us up. My daughter has not spoken to me in about 15 years. I've become sort of okay with it over time. I send birthday and Christmas gifts to my son to give to her. I miss her tremendously, but I will not try to figure out a way to get back in her life. Just wondering how you deal with that.
Again, what I said to start with, everyone's suffering. And I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for that particular form. I don't know that I have anything helpful other than you pray, you send gifts where you can. I don't know. I'm sorry.
That's good. And by the way, as we are talking about suffering and heavy things, like the more that some of this stuff's coming up and becoming real in your life and having personal implications, the more that I am, that our leaders, that Brian afterwards, our prayer team is available for continued conversation, response, those kind of things. So I'm going to invite the worship team is actually going to come up, and we're going to move into a time of communion after this. So here's one more question. This is a hard message. I'm having a hard time with it. I understand there will be several more sessions on what to do with this, hopefully. But is there anything else you can give me for this week to help myself make peace with what I've heard, plus the suffering I've been asked to be reminded of?
I don't want to sound trite or act like this is a simple thing. Develop your soul with Jesus. Become more like him. The best that you know in ways to engage God that change you, lean into that. And hopefully there'll be some more practical tips as we go in the series.
Thank you, Brian. We're going to move into a time of communion.